The smell, that was what clung to Brother Hermas the most stubbornly. Not the scent of dry pine wood or the thick tar the guards had just poured around the base of the stake. Not the sour sweat of the jostling, eager crowd. It was another smell, one his mind tried to reject but couldn't. The smell of burning human flesh. They said the fire would cleanse the soul of sin. But standing here, under the gray November sky, he could only wonder. Could it also cleanse away humanity itself? A roar erupted from the far end of the square, pulling Hermas from his thoughts. The procession had arrived. At its head was the magistrate, his face a stone mask, clutching the scroll that held the death sentence. Behind him, 2 burly guards dragged a woman. Her feet were bare, bleeding from being hauled over the cobblestones. Her hair was a tangled mess, matted to a face streaked with dirt and tears. She wasn't screaming anymore. It seemed all her strength had been spent in the torture chamber. Hermas stood in the area reserved for the clergy, close enough to the pyre to feel its presence, but far enough to be spared the immediate blast of heat. His hand tightened around the silver crucifix on his neck, its cold metal a stark, gruesome contrast to what was about to happen. They bound the woman to the rough-hewn oak post, not with rope, but with heavy iron chains, around her ankles, her wrists, her chest, and her neck. There was no moving, no resisting. Her body was locked in place, exposed to thousands of eyes. Some of those eyes were gleeful, some curious, and a few, like Hermas's, held a fear they dared not voice. He tried to murmur a prayer for her soul, but his throat was dry. The familiar Latin words felt hollow, meaningless. Where was God in this spectacle? The magistrate began to read the sentence. His voice was loud and sharp, listing the crimes Hermas had heard 100 times. Consorting with demons, blighting livestock, casting spells of sickness. The crowd answered with jeers and curses. A witch, a fiend, she must burn. Hermas looked at the woman. She could have been anyone. A mother, a wife, a lonely widow. He saw no devil in her eyes, only terror and resignation. When the sentence was finished, the executioner, a hulking man with a blank face, stepped forward. He carried no axe. His weapon today was a torch. Hermas watched as his assistants finished arranging the kindling and dry straw. They had sprinkled it with something thick and black. Tar. To make the fire burn slower, longer. This was not an execution. This was a meticulously crafted play, and the climax was about to begin. The torch touched the pyre. Then a small, tentative flame. It didn't explode. It crept. It climbed. It slowly licked its way up the dry wood. The crowd fell silent, holding its breath. Hermas could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The crackle of the kindling was the only sound to break the silence. Then the fire reached her feet. A scream tore through the air. A sound unlike anything Hermas had ever heard. It was not a scream of mere pain. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. The flames began to climb, devouring her ragged dress. Hermas could smell the burning fabric. And then, that awful smell returned. Stronger, more sickening. The smell of cooking flesh. He could hear a faint sizzle, the sound of blood in her veins boiling and bursting. He forced himself to watch, for to look away was cowardice, but what he saw would haunt him forever. The skin blistered and then split, revealing the yellowed fat beneath, then the red, twitching muscle. The woman was still screaming, her head thrown back, her body thrashing uselessly against the chains. Her hair caught fire, blazing up in a ghastly halo. Her eyelids were gone. Her lips curled back, baring her teeth in a horrific death grin. Black smoke billowed, thick and acrid, making Hermas choke. Many in the crowd began to cough, but no one left. They were mesmerized by the horror. Hermas felt bile rise in his throat. He saw no purification. He saw only pure, unadulterated cruelty. They were not killing a person. They were unmaking a person, slowly, deliberately, for all to see. Was her soul being saved? Or was it being incinerated along with her body, scattered as ash on the indifferent wind? Finally, the screaming faded, replaced by weak whimpers, and then silence. She had died of suffocation, Hermas prayed. It was the only mercy to be found in this earthly hell. The fire continued its work. Hermas stood frozen, the crucifix in his hand now feeling as heavy as a stone. His faith, once the lighthouse of his life, was now just a flickering candle in the hurricane of truth. The screaming wouldn't stop. Hours after the flames had died and the crowd had dispersed, the woman's screams still echoed in Hermas's mind. He sat alone in the monastery library, bathed in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by thousands of vellum scrolls and thick, leather-bound books. This had once been his sanctuary, a haven of knowledge and faith. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. The words swam before his eyes, but he could not read. Every verse on God's justice, every promise of salvation, was now tainted with the smell of smoke and blood. He wasn't searching for comfort. He was searching for an explanation. A justification. With trembling hands, he turned the pages of the Inquisition's annals, the records kept meticulously by other brothers. He read of a 9-year-old peasant girl in Rouen called Joan, condemned as a heretic for hearing God's voice without the church's permission. They built her a specially tall pyre, so everyone could watch her body writhe in the flames. After she was dead, her ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine. It was not a cleansing ritual. It was an act of erasure, to ensure no relic remained, no memory could be venerated. Hermas shuddered, a cold dread snaking up his spine. The next story was even more cruel in its irony. An English scholar named William Tyndale. His crime? To translate the Bible into English, so that the common people might also read the Word of God. For this, he was hunted across Europe, captured, and condemned. But the court showed him mercy. He was strangled to death before the fire was lit. Hermas closed his eyes. What mercy begins with a noose and ends on a pyre? It was not mercy. It was a cold calculation, to keep the execution tidy, to prevent screams from disturbing pious souls. The fire still burned. The message was still sent. The truth was incinerated along with the man who dared to speak it. Your faith is troubled, my son. Hermas looked up with a start. Bishop Alistair, an old man with deep-set eyes and a face that looked carved from granite, was standing in the doorway. He entered, his leather sandals making almost no sound on the stone floor. Father, Hermas whispered, trying to cover the pages he was reading. Do not, the bishop said, his voice calm. I know what you are looking for. You are looking for God in the ashes. You are looking in the wrong place. Then where must I look? Hermas asked, his voice cracking with desperation. Where was the justice? The salvation in that fire? Bishop Alistair placed a bony hand on his shoulder. The grip was surprisingly strong. Justice is in order, my son. Salvation is for the flock, not for the one stray sheep. The fire is not meant to save the heretic's soul. It is a lesson for the thousands of other souls who watch. It is a warning. Sometimes, to keep the flock on the path, the shepherd needs not a staff, but a torch. Fear is also a tool of God. Those words, spoken with such cold pragmatism, shattered the last foundations of Hermas's faith. He had expected a complex theological argument, a profound interpretation of God's will. Instead, he received a lesson in power, a naked admission that it was all a theater of terror. Hermas said nothing more. He rose silently, bowed his head to the bishop, and left the library. He returned to his small cell and walked to the narrow window overlooking the square. Night had fallen, and a light rain had begun to fall, extinguishing the last of the embers. Where the pyre had stood, there was now only a dark, wet stain on the cobblestones. He no longer smelled the burning flesh. He no longer heard the screams. He felt only a vast, hollow emptiness. The fire had not cleansed the woman's soul. It had burned the truth. It had burned compassion. And tonight, in this small, cold room, it had burned the faith of a young monk. Hermas was no longer a servant of divine justice. He was a silent witness to man's cruelty in the name of God, and he knew that the stain in the square below would never wash away, no more than the scar on his soul ever would.